This is the international symbol of the female gender. How do I learn? I learn by asking questions. We cannot find large number of questions written anywhere. We have to write our questions. We have to think. If we put the right questions, that means we understand the subject. This is the best way of learning. Books are full of answers, but the questions are not written. Therefore, when I read a page in a book, I need to write down the questions that the page has its answers. When we address the female genital system or any subject, we start by going to the basics. Then we ask questions and we go into details. The male or the female genital system or the reproductive system consists of the following. There is a primary sex organ. In case of the female, it is the ovary. Why it is primary? Because it is going to produce gametes. What are gametes? Gametes are what are called sex cells. They contain half number of chromosomes being ready to meet the other sex. Also, gametes also have number of chromosomes. When they meet together, they form the zygote, the very first cell of creating the human body. Plus ducts. Ducts are connected in one way or another to the primary sex organ, and these ducts are modified according to the physiology of the area, and they open to the outside. Plus glands. Whether it's a male or a female genital system, this system needs glands for secretions to create normal physiological conditions. So the bottom line of any reproductive system is that there is a primary sex organ, there are ducts connected to the primary sex organ, and there are glands. Here is a comparison between the male and the female genital system. Starting with the idea of the primary sex organ, in case of the female, you look to the left and you will find that the ovary is inside the pelvis, having the normal temperature of inside of the body. When you look to your right to the male genital system, you will find that the primary sex organ, which is the testes, testes are outside the body in a special skin sac called the scrotum, and the testes to function well needs a lower temperature than that of the inside of the body. How can we make a list of structures making the female reproductive system? We start by an image that contains all the organs. To start with, here is the primary sex organ, which is the ovary. Then we have group of ducts. To start with is the uterine or the fallopian tube. Then there is a midline structure, which is the uterus. The uterus is a rather large organ having a dome-shaped top, which is called the fundus of the uterus. Then we have the body of the uterus, and lower down we have what called the cervix. Cervix is the lowest part of the uterus to open into the vagina, and the vagina opens to the outside, which are the external genital organs. They are also called the vulva, made of a major lip and a minor lip. They can also be called labium majora and labium minora. More details will follow in next few slides. Here is a posterior view of the internal parts of the female reproductive system, and let us first address the primary sex organ, which is the ovary. How much we should know about the ovary? We should know as much as possible. What is the size and the shape of the ovary? It is the shape and size of an almond, and its surface is not smooth because it contains inside it follicles of developing human gametes. Now, the internal organs of the female are at the bottom of the pelvis, and they are enclosed in two layers of the peritoneum, and this is called the broad ligament. Is a ligament of the peritoneum is made of two layers, and the ovary is attached to the posterior layer of the broad ligament, and the broad ligament extends from the sides of the pelvis coming towards the midline. It covers the fallopian tubes, and it covers the uterus as well. What is next? The ovary is connected to the uterus by a ligament of fibrous tissue called the ovarian ligament. And is that the only ligament related to the ovary? The answer is no. The ovary is having what is called the suspensory ligament, suspends the ovary along the inner side of the anterior abdominal wall. This is a diagram of the basic idea of what is the ovary made of. It is made of inner medulla and outer cortex. Now, in the cortex, we are going to have what is called the primordial follicles, the very early developing ova of the reproductive system. They are only present in the cortex, and these primordial follicles will develop along the way, and they start forming what is called primary follicles, then oocytes, secondary follicles, and then mature Graafian follicle. The story of the follicles will be addressed in a coming lecture, called oogenesis, the process of formation of the human ovum. Now, when we go to the medulla does not contain any of the follicles. It contains connective tissue and lots of blood vessels. This is the same figure of the previous one, but now this figure is going to address the basics of the uterine or the fallopian tubes. Of course, this is a posterior view, and if we look at the beginning of the fallopian tubes, you can find that it has lots of little arms called fimbriae, and the singular is a fimbria. And if we look to the left, we can see that these finger-like processes and the big lateral end of the fallopian tube is not continuous with the ovary. It opens into the pelvic peritoneal cavity. Then, after the very beginning of the fimbria, we have the part which is next, and it is called the infundibulum. And then we have the ampulla as we approach the uterus, and all parts of the fallopian tubes are covered by the peritoneum. What is the peritoneum here called? It is called the broad ligament. And then as the tube approaches the uterus, this part is called the isthmus. And then it is going to enter the top lateral part of the uterus. Here is another diagram of the parts of the fallopian or the uterine tube. To start with, it is the fimbria, and the plural is fimbriae. These fimbriae should be free to move, and they do move. And when they move, they go and surround the ovary. Then we have the infundibulum, the ampulla, the isthmus, and in this diagram, it is showing that the part of the tube passing through the wall of the uterus, it is called the interstitial portion of the fallopian tube. Here is a three-dimensional diagram of the fallopian tube, and this organ is the ovary, and this is the ovarian ligament connecting the ovary to the uterus, and these are the fimbriae surrounding the ovary. We will know why this group of fimbriae should surround the ovary. They should be freely mobile to do this surrounding. Next to the fimbriae is the infundibulum, and then we have the ampulla, and then the isthmus, and inside this circle is the point of entry of the fallopian tube into the uterus, and this is called the interstitial part of the fallopian tube. This diagram is self-explanatory, showing the different parts of the fallopian tube. What kind of information do I need to know out of this image? Let's start with basic questions. This arrow is indicating that the cavity of the fallopian tube opens into the pelvic cavity. And this red circle is showing that this is the follicle that will rupture and will release the ovum. The ovum should get into the fallopian tube. It should not fall down in the pelvic cavity. Therefore, the fimbriae will come and surround the ovary so that the ovum will be picked up by the fallopian tube. This is a freshly dissected human body where we can see that we will be talking about the uterus. The uterus is a midline structure and it receives on both lateral parts the two fallopian tubes, and anterior to the uterus is the urinary bladder, which is just posterior to symphysis pubis, and posterior to the uterus is the rectum, the last part of the gastrointestinal tract. All these structures are present in the true pelvis. What is the true pelvis? This is something you already know. Is the deepest part of the pelvic cavity. What do I learn from this image? I learned that the most anterior structure in the true pelvis is the urinary bladder. Then in the female comes the uterus, and extending from the uterus the two fallopian tubes. The uterus and the two fallopian tubes are enclosed in a twofold peritoneum, which is called the broad ligament. Therefore, you can see the blue structures here. The midline is the uterus, and the two lateral tubes, the blue ones, extending laterally. Therefore, the broad ligament divides true pelvis into an anterior part and posterior part. Posterior part contains the rectum. Here is a lateral view where you can see the most anterior part, the yellow part, the urinary bladder, then the blue part, the uterus, because this is a sagittal section, and the uterus, the blue part, is going to open inferiorly into the green part, which is the vagina, and then the most posterior part in the true pelvis is the rectum. This is the normal position of the uterus. Now, in this slide, what do we see? First of all, to your left is anterior and to your right is the posterior structures in this sagittal view. Go to the normal position of the uterus. Sits on the top of the urinary bladder. This is the physiological position where normal pregnancy can happen. But sometimes things go wrong. Because of some reason or another, the uterus is going to change its position, like in grade 1, which is not sitting on the urinary bladder, or grade 2 or grade 3. Grade 3 is called retroverted. Just in grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3, pregnancy cannot happen because the uterus is not in its normal position. You will see people having these problems. This is another view of the normal, what is called anteverted uterus, and the green, blue, and the red unphysiological positions of the uterus. In this diagram, which is also a posterior view, once we see the ovary, then it must be a posterior view. You can go through the different parts of the female genital system, but in this diagram, it is showing that the lower part of the uterus has a ligament, which is called the round ligament. This ligament is going to go to enter the inguinal canal and passes through the inguinal canal, comes out of the external opening and inserts into labia majora, the outer lip of the vulva. Here is a figure which is repeated, and it is left for you to practice the different parts you have already studied. What are the parts of the uterus, and what is the uterus? The uterus is the midline structure of the female genital organ. Where is it? It's in the true pelvis. What is the shape of the uterus? It is pear-shaped, wide superiorly and narrower inferiorly. Is it covered with peritoneum? Yes, it is. The anterior and posterior surfaces. What is the relation of the uterus to the broad ligament? It is in the mid part of the broad ligament, and it has a dome-shaped top, which is called the fundus of the uterus. The major part of the uterus is the body, and the uterus has a cavity inside it lined with a mucous membrane, which is called the endometrium. The story of the endometrium will be studied when you study histology of the female reproductive system. The major bulk of the wall of the uterus is made of smooth muscles, which is called the myometrium, and the outside is covered by the peritoneum. So the major part of the uterus is the body of the uterus. The lowest part of the uterine cavity is called the isthmus of the uterus. Now, this isthmus is going to open into the neck of the uterus, which is the cervix. And the cervix is made of a wall, which is part of the wall of the uterus, and a canal, which is called cervical canal. Now, the cervical canal opens to the vagina, and the opening is called the external opening or the external os, while the cervical canal superiorly in the lower part of the isthmus of the uterus is the internal os. This is a view through a speculum passed into the vagina, and we can see the external os. We can see the lowest part of the cervix, and that is the opening into the vagina, which is the external os, and there are spaces of the vagina around the neck of the cervix. These are called fornices, and the singular is a fornix. This image is showing me the pelvic organs, and when we go and see the uterus ends lower down as the cervix, and the cervix opens into a canal called the vagina, and the vagina will open to the outside. These are the parts of the external genitalia, and we look at the top, and the external genitalia in the female, they are called the vulva, and at the top we have the clitoris. Clitoris is an erectile tissue which is synonymous with the penis of the male. Then we have inferior to the clitoris, we have the urethral opening. Then we have the inner and outer lips of the vagina. Here they are called inner and outer lips. Other references, they are called labia minora, that is the inner lip, and the outer lip is called labia majora. Then posterior to the urethral opening, we have the vaginal opening.